Ling Hoi,
Hey, Ian.
hello. Thanks for joining me on the You Don't Know Vietnam podcast.
Of course. I don't know if other guests have ever told you this, but the intro music to your podcast is called Cải Lương. And I grew up 5 minutes within a Cải Lương theater because that's where my dad and my grandpa and all my uncles worked. That's the music to my heart when I was little.
So tell me what Gai Lung is then, just for those that don't know.
Cải Lương is reformed theater, I believe. I think it has roots thousands and thousands of years ago. It's the national music of Vietnam. I mean, there's three national music of Vietnam. There's Tuồng, Chèo, Cải Lương. It's like endangered species, but like for music. People are not as taken up to Cải Lương anymore these days. So people and the government trying to preserve it as much as possible by funding these theaters, one of which is where my dad has been working, the Golden Bell Theater in the heart of Old Quarter, for almost 40 years now. That's how long he's working there.
That's the one where they have face paint, right?
No, that's Tuong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Tuong is like very dramatic, and there's a lot of dramatic movements and masks and stuff. Cải Lương is sad. Like you just hear a Cải Lương music and it just makes you want to cry forever because Vietnam is it's an old country with quite a sad history for thousands of years. Like the sad history comes from the fact that Vietnam was invaded so many times by different interests, different foreign powers. So when the French finally left and the American came, the American on this side think that, oh, we're liberating the country from the red wave and the communists and whatever, right? To Vietnamese people, it's literally just another one of those invaders that have been eyeing Vietnam, this beautiful country by the ocean. When I talked to my American friends and my American family about that, they were shocked. They never thought that's how Vietnamese people viewed Americans' interest at the time. Like America thinks of the Vietnam War, which in Vietnam we call the American War, as very righteous, right? That's the right thing to do. We were just high on winning fascism or whatever, and now it's our turn to liberate Vietnam. But no, Vietnamese people didn't think that way and still don't think that way. I think that's the one thing there would always be a disagreement on is like, what's the point of that war in the mind of many people?
I can't believe that the music evokes so much memory and so much emotion and so much conversation. I'm glad that it does. Not that it makes one feel sad, but that it evokes something. I think the music is pretty cool. And I've got DJ Jase to thank for that from Saigon, who remixed it.
So you know what they do now with the kind of traditional Vietnamese music, and by they I mean like the people who care to preserve, to prolong the music, is like my dad. He basically combines it with jazz music. He or like some other people combined it with like more modern or like rap music, just so like it's like more palatable to like younger audience because young people do want to appreciate this music. It was associated for a long time with like sadness and frankly like just the government just like force it down our throat a little bit because it's such a huge part of the country. So the young people of my generation didn't feel as much appreciation towards it. But I feel like Gen Z and the TikTok generation, they turn all the way back around and they actually find new appreciation for Cải Lương and the likes.
The other thing I was thinking when you were talking about the American War versus the Vietnam War and how Vietnam's moved on, which it really has, hasn't it, by the way?
I think so. Not completely with the older generation. Like I remember when Bill Clinton visited Vietnam, that was like the first modern president who visited Vietnam. He made the front page of some of the important newspapers. And I remember some old people, yeah, at the time, I think it was the 2000s. So old would have meant like people born in the like 30s or the 40s did have some problem with it. But the young people were just, wow, Vietnam is finally stopped being shunned from like the global economy and like an American president actually made an effort to visit Vietnam. It's a huge milestone. And obviously you fast forward to today and Vietnam loves being integrated into every single facet of the global economy and pretty much wants to consume and produce and be part of any and all products.
It still feels like everyone wants a piece of Vietnam as well. Vietnam's welcoming all sorts of presidents and prime ministers, friends with everyone at the moment. I think it's playing it really well.
Recently, Tim Cook just visited Vietnam and that made headlines. Yeah, I think the country really just wants to be past that stereotype of the country as being war torn. Like it's been such a long time. But I think some parts of the world still think of Vietnam like that. And I think maybe podcasts like yours would like help reshape and refresh people kind of impression of Vietnam.
How do you find people's perception about Vietnam today in America, would you say?
I think it depends on where in America and what kind of exposure these people have to Vietnamese people. If you only have met Vietnamese people who migrated here a long time ago, they would think of Vietnam as that stereotypical war torn, broken, slightly backwards, and they like don't really have a lot of modern like updated imageries of Vietnam to talk about. So they would talk about what they knew the best, which was frozen back in time. Truly, it would be like images of when like they just left, lots of sadness and tragedy. I was basically raised in peace. I have never known war. Born in 1990, and even my parents were born in 1968 knew a little bit of war, but even not that much. So if I asked them, they couldn't have told me too much of their early memories, because once they like gained memories, the country was in peace. Maybe the country was poor and was shunned from global economy, but it wasn't war torn. So when I eventually went to America and I met people who also went to America the education way, I found that it's like almost our duty to just tell American friends that, hey, you should check out Vietnam today and see what you think. I remember the first time my American husband, boyfriend at the time, went to Vietnam, he was surprised that every single coffee shop that we went to was playing American music, and all the theaters, all the cinemas were updated with the latest version of the Spider-Man verse or whatever Marvel and DC were up to those days. Like one day in America and the European markets, and then the very next day in Vietnam. Yeah, the adoption and just the enthusiasm and interest people have in the American culture would surprise a lot of American when they first come here. If you ever went to Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, you'd be like in for a big shock if like your image of Vietnam is like rice paddy and buffaloes. I did not see a buffalo in my life until I was very old. I think way past 20. I was learning how to drive at the time. So like I went down the road very far away from Hanoi. And then I saw a real life buffalo stopping us in the middle of the road. That's my first encounter with one when I was 21.
So it's interesting as well that you've only known peace, and probably your parents pretty much only knew peace as well. I think a lot of people overseas forget that 50% of the population in Vietnam is actually under 30. It's quite a young population.
Such a young country, if you think about it. I am over 30. I'm one of the old folk, and I'm 33. So, yeah, that's mind blowing. So, if I don't know anything about war, even my parents, then basically most of the country has to move on because that's all
Right.
we know.
It does surprise me actually how hospitable the Vietnamese are, considering you talk about the countless foreign entities that have tried to actually conquer Vietnam.
Yeah, I think Vietnamese people are just very warm by nature. And that's like a gross generalization, obviously, like within any country and culture and any people, there are different tiers, different variations. But yeah, I would just say the culture places strong emphasis on warmth and welcoming, hospitality. And I think it started from like village culture. It takes a village to raise a child. So like people would go to the rice paddy to work together. So what do the children do at home? They have to like play together. They have to rely on the kindness of basically the rest of the community. When I was having my child, I was in for a big shock when like my experience with being raised in Vietnam versus my experience raising a child here taught me that it takes a village to raise a child everywhere. Like here, I have to ask. And my in laws are amazing. If I ask, they would absolutely do everything in their power to help me. But the thing is, I couldn't get past having to ask. Like in Vietnam, we would just automatically assume that the village would obviously take part in raising the child, right? And not just like your closest family. It's like your friends and your uncles and your cousins and whoever that are around. At least that was my experience growing up. I would just like roam around from house to house, and the neighbors would be my mom for the day because my parents were not at home. Even though I was in the middle of Old Quarter, I was like a city girl through and through. It was still very much a communal experience rather than just a singular, like, one, two parents household. No, like the rest of the community cares about you as well. You can even see that in the Vietnamese language and the pronouns and the way people address each other. Ian, I assume that you're older than 33, so I would address you as my brother. And Ian, if you were Vietnamese, and somebody who looks like my mom's age, I would call them aunt, go or back, because the assumption is everybody is your family. That's embedded in the Vietnamese language, that you should treat everybody like they're related to you.
I can see the benefits of having such a communal upbringing. Would you say there was any challenges with that as well?
So just like generally lack of personal space, like lack of appreciation for privacy and personal space in general. It's nice for people not to all of the time get into your business and tell you how to do things. Because when you're like at each other's throat all the time, like there's a lot of judgment and there's a lot of harsh words as well that could come your way. Yeah, people are very complimentary in general. People don't want to be mean to your face usually, but people also are very frank in the culture of Vietnam. So instead of just asking politely and implying that they want to know something, they just ask directly. For example, how much do you make? How much do you pay for the car? Like Vietnamese people don't shy away from that kind of conversation. So yeah, I would say just the cons is that I never knew that I needed personal space and privacy until I got out of Vietnam. And then also, I appreciated not being judged so frankly and harshly to my face, like being commented on like my weight or my appearance all the time, for example. So, yeah, there's pros and cons to both.
Was there like societal pressure with everyone kind of being in everyone's business and everyone knowing each other's news?
Yeah, there's a lot of comparison. For example, if their kids go to the same school, everybody knows how their kids rank within the education system, or like what grades they have. One time I was in ninth grade and I was always a good student in the Vietnamese system, but I was also dating. And apparently that's like a taboo thing. Back in the day, like it's scandalous, apparently, for a 15-year-old to have feelings. So then one of my mom's friends, whose daughter was in the same class with me and who was like ranking like around the same like top group, she pulled my mom aside and was like, "Hey, do you know that Ling is dating?" And in a very like judgy voice. And it got to my mom. She was like projecting this like perfect image of, yeah, I have this like daughter who does really well in school, and like how dare you come around and tell me that she was not all perfect. And I want to say to my mom, like if I were my mom at that time, I would be like, good for her. But no, my mom didn't do that. She got pretty upset with me. So yeah, absolutely, there's so much comparison and judgment and pressure because everybody talks.
The Vietnamese quite like a bit of a gossip, don't they? Am I fair to say that? I used to feel like if you needed to know what was going on in the neighborhood, go and speak to the local like tea seller, the lady who's selling tea.
Yeah.
I remember I was sat down with this grandmother who was selling tea on the corner when I used to live in the old quarter as well.
Literally selling tea. So on the nose.
And back then, I had a girlfriend that was a bit older than me, and she had two kids already.
Yeah.
I told this grandmother that my girlfriend was a bit older with two kids. And literally every woman that walked past, she would shout out to her and say, "This guy here's got an older Vietnamese girlfriend, two kids already." And she would say it to every woman that went past. And I said to her, "Why didn't you just shout it on the loudspeaker?"
I mean, a lot of times it builds like trust and connection, just so like people think that because you were comfortable enough to share the story with you, now it's out of your hands. That's her story to tell now. That's her currency now.
Yeah.
If you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like in a communal culture, like that's how people connect via stories. At the core of it, gossips are stories. Now, if they exaggerate the stories and if they tell lies, that's something else. I think it starts from a good goal of just connections. And that's the currency of the communal culture is connections and stories. Building community in Vietnam is so much more about personal connections, not like gossips, but like word of mouth and people's personal trust in your product and your company. In America, it's not as intense. You don't have to build a Facebook groups, for example. You don't have to gather thousands of likes on a community chat. You just have to have a good product. Maybe the market is more mature, so people rely less on word of mouth. But in Vietnam, gotta be all word of mouth.
Yeah. And like these vanity metrics as well,
Absolutely. Social media is like community scoreboards. It's a competitive sports, and people do take that very seriously.
Trust is something that comes up quite a lot on this podcast. In a country where like information is relatively hard to verify or access or might be out of date, I think it's really important but also the building trust thing can't be rushed, I don't think, in Vietnam.
Yeah. I can tell you that people's not gonna buy a product or a service or a concept unless somebody close to them have already verified that. And I have a firsthand experience with that. So before HackerNoon, I was working for this brand new university. I was one of its first 50 employees. So it was back in 2014 when I started working for Minova University. Basically, my job was to convince skeptical Asian parents that this is the next Harvard. Okay. So the first thing I did was I understand the challenge of it being a trust issue, right? Like it is brand new university. There was no one there to verify to these parents that this university works and exists. So I have to build a network of however small the people who actually have gone to the university before. At that point, it was one person, like my best friend now, T. Like she was the only person who was from Vietnam who has been to Minova for 1 year. So together we decided to do like a little campaign that doesn't talk specifically about the university, but talks about the idea of globetrotter and like of like global education, of like how many time zones have you been and how wonderful it is to be like a global citizen of the world. That campaign got overnight success. Within a few days, we got more applications and more interest into the university than we have ever had in our whole history of Minova being in Vietnam. And you know what happened? It got shut off at the headquarter level of Minova in San Francisco because they think that we are off brand. And I was just thinking in my head, dude, like I was hired to be the Southeast Asian regional manager. Like I know how to get to the heart of these Vietnamese parents and students. They need something to grasp onto. Like your whole like Minova speech of whatever innovation, it's not gonna get Vietnamese parents. They don't understand it. They don't buy it.
I think you've touched on something really important. What works in other markets, especially Western markets, and even other Asian markets, isn't necessarily going to work in Vietnam. And I think it's about giving whoever's tasked to market to the Vietnamese the space they need, working perhaps within some guardrails, flexibility to make it work in Vietnam, to connect with the Vietnamese. The way we get around that is we do this body of work up front before we start working with the brand that's based on insights of Vietnamese people. This is the ballpark in which we're playing with regards to positioning and messaging. Still on brand, we get that all agreed first, and then we experiment within that already agreed guardrail. And I feel like let's brand directors from overseas go, okay, they're still respecting the brand, but they're taking these insights from real people in Vietnam and tapping into that to create something that's going to resonate locally.
If you don't have flexibility to get to the level to meet people where they at, then your brand would just sit on this ivory tower forever. Like it's not going to reach the people that you need to reach. It's a reason why all these big global companies have to go to Vietnam and have to develop localization techniques and expertise. It's not that simple.
It's really not that simple in just Google translating it from afar and going, this is the regional message, this is the global message, this is what needs to get translated into Vietnamese.
Yeah.
So you've grown up in the old quarter, around your family, around neighbors, around grandmothers selling tea, gossiping about you dating. And then you go to India on a scholarship with the United World College.
My world all of a sudden completely got turned upside down. And it was so surreal, mainly because for the longest time, for 16, 17 years, I was in this bubble. I was speaking mostly Vietnamese. I was a good student, but in a very rigid way. Like, I can just be a good student if I know my materials by heart. I don't have to be creative in any way whatsoever. I don't have to really share my personal thoughts or feelings about anything. Learning and knowing was just all about what the teachers say. Do what I say, not what I do. So the first time in India where that shocked me was there was an assignment. I think it was Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. It's like a very famous text and it has multiple themes to it. That was the first time I had to analyze an English text, basically doing what Vietnamese people call the subject of literature, but in English. Back in Vietnam, I just learned literature and English as two separate subjects, right? And never have to merge the two, let alone using my own thoughts and my own feelings about the text to analyze it. That was extremely hard. So I took so much notes during the class. And I even asked my roommate, who was Indian, for her notes, which, by the way, in Vietnam, that would have been complimented. Like, everybody would applauded you for going above and beyond to just like gathering all these notes. And when I borrow Namu's notes, that's my roommate's name, and combined with my notes from class, and then I wrote the essay. A week later, I got back the essay, and my teacher at the time did a huge "you plagiarized," like big red letter all over my essay, and was just like, "This is bad." Oh my goodness, that experience brought down my self-esteem like no others. Number one, I have no idea what plagiarism means. Vietnamese education at the time has never taught me that. We literally just paraphrase people's text all the time. That's how we were taught to analyze literature, is like going from sách văn mẫu. Văn mẫu is literally translated to sample text. So you like go from văn mẫu to like the teacher's notes, to maybe some of your notes, some other people's notes. You combine it into this hodgepodge of essay. Apparently, you're not supposed to look at any notes at all. You know, you're just supposed to like discuss in the class and have your own feelings about these are like some big topic for a 17-year-old Vietnamese girl who has never ever studied about African nationalism. That experience like scarred me a lot. So it's just a sneak peek into the many differences between the two education systems. Vietnamese at the time when I was educated wanted to produce people who listen to orders, who listen to instructions, who would be great corporate workers, government workers, factory workers, people who don't need to like transit or anything. The Indian education I was receiving was the United World College education. I would consider that a global Western education. And that through line into my brown education is very much trying to produce like the liberal arts type, able to mix and match ideas, comprehend things in different ways, and hopefully being business owners and trendsetters and set up the next, I don't know, Tesla or Apple. So it's like throwing me from like this tiny little pond into the big ocean, almost drowned. Like, it was a very scary experience for a 17-year-old to go through.
I wonder how much the Vietnamese education system has changed since then. And if it hasn't, do you think it's failing young Vietnamese people in terms of being prepared for the world?
I think it has got to change since, even between me and my brother, who are 8 years apart. I think he was allowed the freedom that I wasn't. He was allowed the ability to be creative with the text. I remember back in his 11th grade, he got an assignment to like make a play out of the Vietnamese traditional Thuy Kiêu. Kiêu is like a very important story in the Vietnamese culture. It's about the story of the girl who like sold herself to save her father. He was able to use the text in a more expansive manner. Like he was doing like a play, he was doing voices, he made some jokes about the play as well. So I remember that. So yeah, to answer your question, it has got to change over time now, because I've seen that within the people we hire at HackerNoon as well, with the young new Vietnamese people that I started to hire for my company. And I see that, yeah, they have the work ethics, they have the things that are so hardcore and ingrained into my Vietnamese education as I knew it, but they also could talk about modern culture and I could analyze what's happening right now in Palestine and could talk to me about gender fluidity and things. So
Right.
I don't know if it's like the TikTok education or it's like Vietnamese traditional education. It could be the muse of the two, because we cannot distinguish between what's online and what's offline right now with the way Vietnamese people in general and just honestly the world consume technology these days. But I do see one perk is that the younger people of 16, 17-year-old, like the early 20 people, they don't seem as naive as I used to.
I think that's definitely got to do with the internet. When you were kicking around the old quarter, you didn't have a smartphone, right?
Not at all. I didn't know what a smartphone was until I left Vietnam, like way after I left Vietnam. Yeah.
It's got to be Facebook. It's got to be TikTok. Vietnamese kids are on their phones a lot.
I feel like COVID and the pandemic accelerated this new generation of people who were just glued to their phones.
You touched on something that I've wanted to talk to someone about for ages, but never really found the right person. Maybe it's you. Maybe I can talk to you about this. Can you help me explain or break down Song Ao?
Oh, sống ảo. Sống ảo means you live online. Literal translation, sống means to live, and ảo is not real. Ảo is online. Okay. So sống ảo, just basically a way, like a derogatory term people use for people who do something only for the likes, only for the internet cred, as opposed to actual street cred.
Honestly, I've never seen people take photographs and pose for photographs and dress up for photographs and get props in for photographs as much as in Vietnam. And it is not only the young generation, it's the aunties, the mothers, the grandmothers as well. There's a key for success in Vietnam would be to create an Instagrammable wall in your restaurant or outside your cafe that is just perfect for a photo shoot. And you will have queues of people lining up to do a shoot, full makeup, full camera team. And I'm wondering, what's this even for? And it's literally just for Facebook.
Yes. So I think the importance of Facebook is not to be undermined here at all, because I live with American family, American husband, American friends. People here don't care much about Facebook. People have long past the fascination and infatuation with this technology. They have moved on to something else. Certain number of people still use Facebook, and Instagram is still quite popular. But for the most part, people think of Facebook as like boomer technology here in America, right? Not in Vietnam. In Vietnam, that's like the technology. That's how you score things. Like that's how you make an entire business. That's where earlier in our conversation, we talk about like comparison and gossips. What better way to gossip and to accelerate the speed of information rather than Facebook? You can just do whatever on Facebook and everybody would know. So I think people feel the need to do business there, being very entrepreneurial there. So I think that's part of it is what drives like the photos and like the foot traffic to the restaurants, just so they can show it for the likes on Facebook as well. But also part of it is like that's the community scoreboard, like I mentioned earlier. So that's how people measure success. If a person like having this shit together, it's not even like the most updated with like Vietnamese technology or use of Facebook, and like the many other things like Zalo. I think people like use Zalo more for like scoreboard and things like that now, the feed. But yeah, I say a combination of those type of social media platforms is what people place the most importance in.
So, what is it that shocks you most, apart from perhaps the use of the smartphone, when you come back to Vietnam these days?
Just a speed at which things happen. I have to do with where I am in America. Like I live in Colorado, and it's like a mountain town, very quaint and very quiet. And if we want to order like some things on Amazon, I have to wait for a couple of days. In Vietnam, I would order something off Shopee and it arrives in 2 hours. And the shipper would be like, I'm so sorry it arrived so late. We guarantee 1 hour. So I was shocked. Again, that gap between 18 to 22 is when I see the most surprising things about the development in Vietnam, the growth of technology, adoption of technologies, people's expectation of what technology can do. That's when the most jump happened to me. So yeah, I was most shocked by like the expectation that things just instantaneously arrive within an hour.
Just on the e-commerce stuff, so I've got some stat bombs for you. 54.3% of the 100 million population buy something online weekly from Shopee, Lazada, TikTok Shop, Tiki, or Grab. And that's projected to grow 28% annually for the next 2 years. Next time you come back, e-commerce is going to be even bigger. So I know Vietnam's been viewed a certain way in the past and perhaps even currently. What do you think the Vietnam brand could be on the world stage?
Like to a global audience.
Yeah.
If I were to like give a TED talk about come to Vietnam or something, I would say the best quality of the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese businesses in general are just their agility and just the entrepreneurial spirit of the people despite lack of resources and lack of whatever. People don't seem deterred by challenges or by shortage of things. So I just say people are just so agile and so resilient in the face of hostility and in the face of challenges and shortage and lack of resources. The Vietnamese brand, the country, is super young, so very adaptive because we're young. We don't really have the baggage of an older country, right? With expectation, privileges, with things that they know, oh, in the past old day or like in the good old days, things used to be like that. No. In the good old days, we didn't have anything because we weren't born. This is all we know. Gotta hustle. Yeah, I just feel like to a global audience, I would say hire in Vietnam. Oh my goodness, absolutely. I've been hiring for HackerNoon for 8 years now. I hired from Europe, I hired from Africa, from everywhere in America, from Vietnam, from Pakistan, India, places in Asia. And I would just say Asia in general, Vietnamese people in particular, amazing work ethics, very enthusiastic, very passionate, willing to make compromises, willing to integrate into the culture, whatever the culture is of the company, right? So definitely hire in Vietnam.
You saying about in other countries where we're like, oh, gone are the days when, back in my day. And it feels like in Vietnam, there's a general feeling, and this comes up a lot as well on this podcast, that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And we have a plan to make it happen.
There's no sense of entitlement and fall back into the good old days. It's always, no, we have to move forward to the good new days because that's the future, right? That's what we're building towards. My parents have to sacrifice a lot so that our life is better. And I think like that mentality carry forward to other generations as well. Like people just want to take charge of their own future and of their own Vietnam, just make it as good as they can be. I think that's where they think business happens. Unfortunately or fortunately, you can think of it either way because honestly, it also democratizes a lot of things that used to not be as equal, like women, people in the countryside versus people in the cities, young people, old people who have more resources, like richer versus poorer people. With the smartphones, with the technology, it democratizes so much of that. It makes it so flatter for things to happen. And gotta give props to just if any people would adopt technology, that would be the Vietnamese people. Like they just adopt things like that, like whatever technology.
I like to end these episodes by asking you, what are you most excited about for Vietnam?
I'm just so optimistic about the young generation. That's my biggest hope, is that they don't just care about the things that my generation, my parents, grandparents' generation used to care about, which is just security, stability, economic prosperity, things like that. They like start to care about the world now. They start to care about sustainability. They start to care about gender equality, like just social things. And I think we were afforded that because our previous generations worked hard so that we don't have to worry about that Maslow pyramid. Like if you have to worry every single day being bombed, if you have to worry every single day not having enough food on the table, then how are you going to fight for gender equality, right? Like, obviously, that's not the biggest priority back in the days. But I think now that the country is in pretty good economic position, good strategic geography as well, to just be like, there's two big global powers. There's America, there's China. We're close to China, but they're our enemy for a lot of the times. But we don't want to be like directly averse to them for many reasons. But then there's also America, who needs allies. And all to say that Vietnam is in a strategic position to be friends with people and to develop economically and socially without having to go too much one way or another. And that's great. That's a bright future for the country and for the young generation too. I'm hoping that when my children come back to Vietnam, because I hope they sure one day would do to find half of their root, they would have even better time and better life than I am currently feeling like I'm awarded and I'm afforded. And that way it's very similar to my grandparents and my parents, what they were thinking back then. It's getting better.